Welcome back, guys. Now, I'm very proud of everyone for getting this far. What you've written up till now is a lot of the fundamental React and Redux code. Much of the patterns that you're writing are pretty much the patterns, 90% of what you will write when building an application. There's 10% where things get more advanced and more complicated when it comes to perhaps building more complex features. But the approach of breaking it one at a time and then fitting it inside of the existing flow of how we've been writing our React and Redux code is going to be definitely the sticking point of why your career as a JavaScript developer, especially with React, will all pay off in the end. Now, up until this point, we've been building new features with our React and Redux flow. But there's a couple things that we can actually move over, and I want to do right now because we want to practice this pattern that we've been writing when building all the things that we've built in the last few lessons. In order for us to figure out what they are, let's take a look back at our application. So there's a couple places right now where we're storing on a component state the things that we can actually move into our Redux. In our home page, we have our directory, if you remember, on our homepage component. On our homepage component, inside of our directory, we keep the sections that we display inside of the state. But this is actually something that perhaps we can move into our store, because there's an opportunity for us to possibly move these sections into more than one component. For example, if right now what we're displaying does not maybe work in a mobile view, right? If our application shrinks and we want to display our directory in a way that's more mobile friendly, we can pretty much just pull in the same array and then create a component that displays it in a mobile friendly way. Another place where we can modify is actually our shop. Right now, we're keeping all of the collection data inside of our shop state. And we do store it inside of the shop data, right? .js. But it is being technically held on the shop component inside of the state. And we can move this out as well because eventually we do want that same data to populate our category pages when we build that. So for example, inside of our collections preview right now, we show the first 4 items in each category. But in the actual category page itself, we want to show all the items. So we want to be able to share that data inside of our Redux state so everything will have access to it. So let's start doing that and get a better practice of our React Redux stuff. The first thing I want to move out is actually what's in our directory component. And for us to do this, we can make a directory Redux folder. So let's close some of this stuff. And inside of our Redux, we will make a new folder called directory. Now, we don't have anything that actually updates these sections, so we don't actually need any actions. We just want a place to store our directory literally as state. So we'll just make a reducer. So we'll do directory.reducer.js. And for our reducer, we are just going to set our initial state first. And our initial state will point to this directory information. And it will pretty much be the default state. Now you might be wondering, is there really a reason for us to move this outside of our directory class component if we're not going to update it, or if we don't currently have another component that's going to pull it in? Well, this is actually where there's a lot of debate about whether or not it's worth it to keep one-time use unmodifiable data inside of a component. Some people say that it's a little bit of overkill to move this data where it's only being used in one place and not being updated into Redux. But there's actually a benefit to doing this that we will not explore until later on in the course inside of our testing section. But one thing that we've largely not talked about is testing. And the reason why is because testing, it's extremely important inside of web development, but it's really important to grasp the fundamentals before we start writing our tests. Because testing and learning about testing really makes sense once you've grasped the fundamentals of what it is that you're writing. Because in a way, testing is its own thing that builds upon the fundamental understanding that you already have. But to the original point, moving our state outside of our component and into their own reducers actually makes it easier to test. But we won't talk about that for now. I just want you to perhaps think about what's to come. But it also sets us up in a way so that in the future, if we do need to use these sections again, we already have the code set up for us. There's no harm in doing it. And it allows our directory component in some ways to be more reusable. So now that we have our directory reducer, let's actually build the reducer code. So I'll say const directory reducer equals this function that takes a state, if we remember, right? Which by default will be the initial state. And then we're also going to have our action. And what we'll say is a switch statement on action.type, but inside we'll just write our default, which is to return state. This is perfectly fine. If we have more actions that might modify the state, we'll bring them in after. But for now, this is good enough. And we'll export out our directory reducer. Now, inside of our root reducer, we got to remember to bring in our new reducer, our directory reducer. From directory reducer. And then let's point to our directory reducer under the directory key. And now, inside of our directory component, we can just simply pull that component, pull the connect in, right? Our higher order connect component from React Redux. And here we will actually write our connect. So because we don't need this local state anymore, we can just render a regular functional component because we don't need access to state. So there's no reason to use a class component. So let's get rid of extra brackets here. And then we'll make sure to pull the sections off of our props that we get in. And then we'll write our map state to props, where we can write our directory selector. So we'll make a new directory.selectors.js. And here we're going to import create selector from reselect. And we're going to make our first selector, which is our directory selector. Select directory equals a function that gets the state and just returns us state.directory. And then we'll actually write our first selector, which will be select directory section, which will be equal to create selector, taking in our select directory, and then outputting directory.section. create selector. So let's bring that into our directory component. It will be from our Redux folder, directory/directory selectors. And we want our select directory sections as well as our create structured selector. Reselect. So it's definitely a lot of files and a lot of moving around and jumping between these files, importing the right libraries, and remembering all these things. It took me a long time to get fully comfortable with being able to just remember all the moving parts as well. But again, practice makes perfect. So we will call create structured selector, passing our sections, our select directory section. And then we will connect our directory with our map state props. And now, double imported. Okay. And now if we look, we see that in our final application, on our home page, our code still works. We have our directory, and we have our sections inside of our state. So it's definitely a lot of files to remember, and even then we're not writing any actions. But even this is still good practice, just to remember all the parts of flowing through, writing a new reducer, attaching it to our state, pulling it into our components. Practice makes perfect. The more practice we have, the better it gets. So now let's do this for our shop before we build our category pages, because we'll definitely need our shop in its own reducer. In this lesson, what we're going to tackle is moving the shop information that we're displaying in our shop page into its own reducer, the same way that we just did with our directory. So we want to move our shop.data.js into its own reducer rather than keep it on our shop page component, the way that we have in its internal state right now. Some of you might be wondering, in a traditional application, how is this data stored? Especially if this list of items grows beyond the maximum of 10 per category that we have. Well, a lot of the times it's actually stored on a backend. And on a backend, it's easier for them to put the new items and then have all the respective front-end applications, like a web application or a mobile application, pull in the data from the backend so that it's always consistent versus keeping this data on the front end. However, we won't be doing that in this lesson. We would do that in a future lesson on Firebase, in a more advanced Firebase section, just so you're familiar with the actual pattern of what it's like to pull that information into your shop component. But right now, there's a lot that we can still get out of keeping it on our front end, because there's a lot of additional Redux things that we can take advantage of that we'll cover in the next lesson. But in this lesson, simply the practice of putting our shop data inside of a reducer is still valuable. And I know we just did it with our directory, but as I mentioned, practice makes perfect. And there's going to be a couple things that we're going to do that'll get really interesting with the way that we're doing our shop data right now. So let's actually start. The first thing we need to do is add a new shop Redux folder. And inside, we need our shop.reducer.js and also our shop.selectors.js. We're also going to bring our shop data down from our component folder into our Redux folder. And then in our reducer, we're going to use it. So we're going to declare our initial state. And here we're going to say collections point to our shop data. So we have to import that in. And we'll say collections points to that array. And now for our actual reducer function, we're going to say shop reducer equals a function that gets the state, which by default is initial state, as well as an action. And then we'll write our usual switch statement, but just like we did with our directory, because there's no modifications, we only have our default, which returns the state. And then we'll export out our shop reducer and pull it into our root reducer. So let's import in our shop reducer. And let's say shop points to shop reducer inside of our root reducer. So now that we have our root reducer set up with our shop reducer, we need to actually pull it into our shop component. So inside of our shop component, we know that we don't need shop data anymore, and we don't need the constructor. So we can actually switch our class component over to a functional component. And we know we'll be passing collections in. And let's just fix up our brackets here. And then we need to actually connect this new component now to our Redux. But before we do that, we also know that we need our selectors. So let's go to our new shop.selectors file. And let's bring in our create selector from reselect. And then first we'll declare our initial input selector, which is our select shop, which gets the state and returns state.shop. And then we'll have our select shop items, which will be equal to create selector, taking our select shop, and then with a function of shop.shop items. Let's go back to our shop component and pull in both the selector as well as connect. Redux shop selector. We also need both connect and our create structured selector. So we need connect from React Redux and create structured selector from reselect. And now in our const map state to props, it will be create structured selector with collections going to our select shop item. Actually, this name is wrong. It's supposed to be select collections. I just realized that we actually named that incorrectly. So inside of our shop selectors, let's just fix up that naming and then change our component to be the right one. Point to the right thing. And then connect our map state to props in. And now let's see our shop component. Oh, reselect is spelled wrong. Reselect with an E. Cool, everything works. So as you saw, it's a lot, it's so many files, right? With React and Redux, it's always just getting used to making all the right files, right? Calling in the right libraries, setting up the right code. It's definitely something that needs a lot of practice. And the more practice we have, the better. But as you saw, even I stumble, right? Just keeping track mentally of all the things and the pieces and the moving parts that we need. It's always difficult once you do the first setup. But after that, we saw before how easy it was just to add new actions, pull in state, right? Once all of our correct components are connected to the state, it's just the initial setup is a little lengthier. So now that we have our shop component and we have it connected, let's start actually building our category pages. Because now we're able to leverage the collections that we've got stored on our Redux state. Before I continue, I just want to take a second and say how proud I am of you for having completed the course up until this section. Believe it or not, almost 80% to 90% of applications built in React and Redux followed the exact patterns that we've done up until this point. There's, of course, more complexity and more optimizations you can bring in from other libraries or using other patterns, but the foundation of what we're learning is pretty much all there is to React and Redux. The way that we tackle features and we think about how to break them down and split out the problems and then correspondingly solve them in the existing React and Redux architecture that we are now so familiar with is pretty much the majority of what it's like to build websites in React and Redux. And I'm so proud of you guys for coming up until this point. Now, I will say, we will definitely continue to finesse our basics from this point forward, but we're going to start looking at other perspectives and other ways that we can possibly build upon what we already learned and expand upon the concepts that we are only going to become more familiar with. Now, in this specific section, we're actually going to look at something regarding a slight tweak to our Redux state so that it becomes more performant in what it is that we're about to attempt. So what we want to build next is our category page. And right now, the category is going to pull in one of the collection objects in order to display the items inside. So in our final application, we can see this when we look at our hats page. We see that we've pulled in the hats category and we've displayed the items inside. So let's actually build this into our existing application. And what we'll need to do is actually render inside of our shop page nested routes. Because right now, we mostly have routes at our app level. So if we look at our app.js, we only have routes here. But we can actually put routes in our other components and they'll start from where that page is being rendered as their base slash. So we'll see what that looks like once we actually start writing it. So let's go to our shop page and look at what we need to do. So inside of our shop component, we actually want to move our collections map into its own component. And once we move it out, we won't need the collections anymore on our shop page component. We're going to tie everything that we need that's attached to our collections previews into a collections overview component that is connected to the state that will get the collections. So let's make that folder now. So inside of our components, we're going to make a new folder called collections overview. And inside we need our collections overview. So I'm just going to copy this so I don't make a spelling mistake later. .component.jsx, as well as a collections overview.styles.sass. And we're going to do our usual import React from React, as well as importing in our style sheet. Now, we know we're going to need connect from React Redux. And we also know that we're going to need our create structured selector. Because we're pretty much just going to do everything that we need to do that we've already got in our shop page, except move it into our collections overview. And now we know that our collections overview is going to be a functional component that gets the collections. And then we're going to render a div with the class name of collections overview. And then inside will be our map. So let's go to shop and let's copy this code over and paste it in. Now we also need our collection preview component. So let's bring that in as well. Is our collection preview component? Oh, this is not .component. So let's actually rename this so that it's consistent with our other naming. I think I must have accidentally forgot to put .component there, but no worries. So now that we have our collection preview, we need to connect our collection preview accordingly. So we also need our selector. So we can actually just pull this off as well as this. We know we won't need any of this, so let's just get rid of it. So let's copy this code into our collections overview. And then we're going to call our connect on our map state props, which is going to connect to our collection overview. Support default. And now we're missing our selector, which we'll also copy over. And we will also need to now modify and bring our collections overview into our shop component. Components, collections overview component. Okay. Now let's just render just our collections overview. I think we need to also modify our style sheet. And we'll just target our collections overview high-level div component. And we'll give it a display flex and a flex direction of column, just so that all of our content sits vertically. And now if we look at our app, collection preview is not exported from collection preview component. Oh. Don't think we need those brackets. There we go. Okay, so it was a default export. And now if we go to our shop page, right, everything is still working as it was before, except now our collection preview is in its own component. So now for our shop component, what we're going to do next is actually selectively render inside of nested routes, where one route is going to lead us to our collections overview when we're only on shop, right? So nothing but just /shop. But then we'll also render our new category page, which will build when we land on our /category. So let's see how we're going to build that next.